So, when you think about the biggest threats to birds, what do you think of? Chances are cats come to mind or wildlife, but buildings are actually one of the biggest threats, if not the biggest. Listen to this stat. Environment Canada estimates that between 16 and 42 million birds die after flying into windows in Canada every year. Huge numbers. And that's what we're going to talk about today, what the researchers are doing to try and reduce those deaths and what you can do in your own backyard to help. If you're listening in for the first time, thank you for listening in to Wild About Wildlife. I'm your host, Kathy Mueller, and you are in for a real treat today. My guest is known as the dead bird guy around campus at Western University in London. He is Dr. Brendon Samuels. And now, Brendon, just a month ago, I could not have called you doctor. Congratulations on being awarded your PhD, and welcome to Wild About Wildlife.
Thanks for having me. And yeah, I appreciate it. It's been a real privilege to work on this topic for my PhD and to count on Salthaven for support along the way.
Well, and I was reading a little bit about your history, and it seems you took quite the pivot in your career and the trajectory that you're on now. So the dead bird guy, let's start there. How in the world did you become known as the dead bird guy?
Yeah, I fell into this work kind of accidentally. I started doing my undergraduate studies at the University of Guelph in psychology and came to Western University in London for a master's degree in the neuroscience program. And I was interested in studying how birds hear. I was looking at the ways that people process the organization of rhythm in music and some analogs to that in the ways that the brains of birds might process the organization of rhythm in birdsong. After I finished that degree, I decided I really liked Western and my supervisor, and I wanted to figure out a way that I could use my skills and my knowledge to solve a problem in the world. And that's what led me to look at this problem of birds crashing into glass on buildings, which to me, I approach as a sensory problem. It's a matter of what birds can see. And so it's been a winding path, starting from looking at people to now really focusing on the birds. And part of my work at the university has involved trying to figure out where on our campus birds are vulnerable to crashing into buildings. And we raised awareness of that work by collecting some of those unfortunate birds that didn't survive the impact. In doing that work, people began to recognize me as the guy that was running around campus collecting birds, which was very upsetting work, but also very hopeful work because we were able to rally the community and affect a lot of positive change that I am confident is saving thousands of birds' lives.
Yeah, I was reading an article from the newspaper at Western, and they say that with you it started because you saw one dead bird, and then that you put it out on social media to your fellow classmates that, hey, you see dead birds, let me know.
Yeah, exactly. We use social media to good advantage, and that helped a bunch during the COVID when people were really disconnected. People often experience this in a very siloed way, where a bird hits their window at their house or in the building where they work, and they think, that's weird, that was a freak accident. And then they don't really do anything with that experience. And I was really inspired by approaches taken by a nonprofit that I work for called the Fatal Light Awareness Program, or FLAP Canada, where they take advantage of what's called citizen or community science, and they invite members of the public as well as a broad volunteer base to collect records of those incidents involving birds and windows. And so by using social media, I was able to reach out and to access a large network of students and faculty and staff at the university and let them know what my research was about and how they could support me.
And then, so you said that you were able to advocate, and there's positive change that has come about at Western. So what does that look like?
If you walk around our campus at Western, you'll notice that many of our buildings now, I think 14 or 15 of them, have a grid of dots in the glass on at least part of the building. And the reason those dots are there are because either the building was constructed and then monitored by myself and other volunteers, and we found birds that had been injured or killed, and we motivated the university to invest in retrofitting those windows. Or there are new buildings being constructed on campus that are using bird safe glass, which has the markers built into the glass meant to protect birds by preventing collisions. And so our university has become a leader, I would say, in Canada and in the world, in really taking this seriously, in prioritizing funding for retrofits of these buildings to make our campus more bird friendly, and adopting a bird safe design standard for new construction. And what I love most about this work is when I talk to people on our campus, they know about the dots now. They say,
Oh,
"Oh,
great.
that's for the birds. You're the reason that the building where I work in has this treatment, and I wondered about it." And people value it. They care about birds. They want to do our part as a university, to protect the environment, and it's just a very positive story about sustainability and our ability to affect change in our worlds that benefit other species.
Oh, you must be so thrilled and how rewarding to have that kind of an impact.
It's really like a huge privilege, and I feel like sometimes I mean, I'm here speaking with one voice. I'm a student that has done some of the work, but it's always done as a coalition, as a team. Like there have been so many volunteers, so many faculty members and other students that have supported this work in various ways, writing grants, collecting the birds. I feel honored to be associated with the work, but I've never felt like I was going at it alone, and the successes we share.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation about the idea of community science. So that's one of the three C's that you talk about: collisions with wildlife, connectivity, and the community science. So we're going to dive into each one of those, but you say that you see them all as being interconnected, those three aspects. So, how so?
Yeah, so I studied collisions for my PhD, collisions specifically between birds and buildings. But unfortunately, birds and other wildlife suffer all kinds of other collisions too. They can collide with power infrastructure, with vehicles, some with wind turbines. And when those birds collide, it's because there are, conflicts that arise from where we put these things, how we build them, that we've not necessarily accounted for wildlife movement through that local environment. And when collisions occur, it's quite important that we understand how to analyze that mortality data on at the landscape level. So, with community science, for instance, when birds collide with buildings on campus or across London, Ontario, we encourage people to upload a record of the bird that has been killed, or injured, using a platform like iNaturalist, or there's one called the Global Bird Collision Mapper, where if you take a photograph of the bird and the location, you can post that and it becomes a public record showing this is what happened on this day at this time. And we have a project that aggregates that data and is very useful for informing conservation management, so we can understand where should we prioritize these treatments, mitigation to prevent more bird deaths, but also to demonstrate to decision makers this is happening, this is real, it's in our community, it's happening on our campus or across London, and we should take action to prevent that. And for me, it's also about, a way of processing the grief that comes with, unfortunately, interacting with death, and that an animal has lost its life. And that can mean something. That can actually be useful for research and conservation if we take that extra step, to record the data. And I've worked with people at Salthaven in the past. When you guys receive birds that have been injured as intake, is there a way that we can log records of where those collisions have happened? And I've found that the staff have been quite supportive of that work. I mention that in the context of connectivity because I think sometimes what happens with birds that hit windows is they're going from one place to the next, and oh, surprise, there's a piece of glass in their way and they didn't see it. And it's kind of like if you're a turtle trying to cross the street to get from, one piece of wetland to the next, and the connectivity between those habitat patches that animals depend on has been broken by urban development, by roads, by, hazards like glass buildings. And we can account for where that connectivity has been broken or where it can be improved using that community science data. And I think collisions are a great instance of how we can document hazards that we know about, and then take steps to deal with those hazards using an evidence-based approach.
There's so much to unpack here. A lot of the work is by its nature reactive because you have to wait for a bird to die to advocate on its behalf and on other birds' behalf. But it's also very proactive in the advocacy that you're doing. What are your suggestions in terms of, okay, a developer's building a new development or there's a new shopping mall that's going to be going up, and how do they take into account that what they're building could impact the lives of birds in this case?
Yeah, that's a great segue. And I mean, even though I'm trained as a biologist, I often feel more like a planner in that I'm trying to figure out how we can bridge that biological knowledge into urban planning and policy and using the tools of government and land use planning to prevent harm. I think developers have a huge role to play, and they often get maligned because in our current environment, habitat loss is one of the greatest threats to the natural world. And I think developers get a bad rap for being associated with driving that trend. But I see a lot of developers that are actually prepared to do the right thing. They don't want to cause wildlife to suffer. They also recognize that we need to build housing for people to live in. And so there's different ways that they can design mitigation, like when they're putting in a road somewhere, designing wildlife crossings. That can be a culvert that runs under the road. That can be traffic calming measures, like putting up signage to alert people. Oh, there's a wetland here, so there's a good chance you're going to see geese crossing the road. It can be tricky to predict where wildlife are going to move in an urban environment that hasn't been built yet. And we do have planning principles and policies that are meant to account for those things, but I think they're not where they should be. And in particular, I see a lot of breakdown happens when we're talking about interfacing the public realm, your boulevards, for example, public parks, and the private realm, like what people are doing in their gardens and in their front yards with pollinator gardens and such, which can attract wildlife. But our policies, our regulations, our planning principles, they treat these in a very piecemeal, siloed way. And I would love to see us move towards a more interconnected way of thinking about wildlife movement through our built environments. Particularly as London is undergoing a building boom, we need to be thinking very carefully about what's going to happen to the animals that are currently present and will continue to be present, even when we're starting to create new subdivisions where habitat now exists.
And are you starting to see that shift? You were saying that most or a lot of the developers are getting on board with this, so that shift is happening. And I'm assuming a lot of it gets back to just raising awareness and making them aware of the potential impact of their designs.
Yeah, indeed. I think the awareness is shifting. I often hear from the development community that the market drives what they build. And I think in London, we have a general public that cares deeply about our natural heritage system and about wildlife. We care about being a forest city and all the other creatures that live here. And so I think it's incumbent on the developers to make sure that their projects are representing the values of their clients. That's not to say mistakes aren't made, but sometimes it's about what you do with that failure, right? Like if you build something and then it turns out, oh, birds are being killed. We should have probably not put an untreated glass railing there, or there were turtles in that pond and now they're being killed crossing the road. When you identify that there's a hazard, let's say through community science data, it's what you do with that information, the next step, that can make all the difference. For example, the City of London has a process by which, if you identify a hazard for wildlife, like where there's a lot of roadkill, they can install signage to let motorists know, drive carefully through this area. Those are the kinds of tools that I think we need to take better advantage of, but it needs to be data driven so that we are making best use of our limited resources.
So let's talk about the community science angle of all of this and how that bird lover in their backyard can attract birds to their yard, but do it in a way that they aren't inadvertently harming them.
Absolutely. Birds have the benefit of being very charismatic. They're well loved by many people, and they're among the best studied of animal groups. People have been monitoring birds for like many, many, many decades. And London, Ontario actually has a rich history of community science monitoring. We have the longest continuously running Christmas bird count in all of Canada, I believe.
Hmm.
And there's now ongoing projects like Project Feeder Watch, where you can contribute records of birds visiting your backyard at certain times of the year. And that data helps us to understand how bird population trends are shifting with climate change and insect loss, etc. I think to your point, when we feed birds in our backyard, it means we also have to recognize that doing so potentially exposes birds to certain risks, like risks that we have control over. If we have pets like dogs or cats that use our backyards and we allow them to run outside unsupervised when we're attracting birds at the same time, that's a recipe for some negative interactions that we are responsible for because cats and dogs are not part of the ecosystem. Similarly, if you've got windows on your home, which most homes have, it's really important that you mark the glass so that birds will recognize it as a solid barrier they can't fly through. The reflection off of your window or a glass railing around your deck that's just see through, birds will not be able to recognize that they can't go there. And sometimes what it takes is a hawk flying overhead or a loud noise, and the birds get startled and they just end up smacking into the glass. What I see people do is they'll put, one or two stickers up on the glass and think that that is effective. Unfortunately, research has found it's not. You have to make sure that you're covering the entire surface of the glass with markers and not leaving gaps too much wider than a bird. So 5 centimeters or so in between dots or lines is generally a good parameter to follow. You can draw lines with markers. You can apply a product called feather friendly tape, which I know Salthaven has for sale and also has used on your center to good effect. You can hang pieces of string every few inches. There's a variety of different ways that we can treat glass. I think what we need to do, though, is move towards new houses being built bird safe in the first place. And currently in Canada, there are no residential builders that have adopted bird safe design into their homes, which to me is a gap and an area I think for improvement.
Bird safe designs, does that mean would you love to see every new home being built with the feather friendly tape or some kind of markers on all the windows? Is that where you're going?
Yeah, the cheapest way and easiest way to make a home bird safe is to just build it to be bird safe in the first place. I talk to a lot of people who unfortunately realize that birds are hitting their windows, but they can't get up on a ladder to access the second floor windows to treat the outside. And treating the inside of the glass is generally less effective, or there's a tree in the way. It doesn't have to be that feather friendly product specifically, which is usually for retrofitting existing windows. New glass can have the dots or whatever pattern built right into it. But there's a lot of interest now in new homes being more sustainable, net zero, energy efficient. And we should consider biodiversity impacts as part of that conversation around what we want lasting homes to look like.
How do you change people's perception that it's gonna look horrible? I'm putting dots up on my window. It's going to ruin my view. I got like you mentioned the deck railing being a plate of glass and right, people get that for a certain aesthetic, and last thing I wanna do is put dots up on it. That's gonna ruin the view.
Yeah, I encounter that a lot, and I get it. I'm an aesthetically motivated person too. Um, I think part of why we have so much glass on our buildings is that that was an aesthetic preference that became popular and going back to the 70s and 80s, and it just became normalized, and now we just expect floor to ceiling windows everywhere. Really, solving this problem for birds is about changing human expectations about what is a window or a building supposed to look like. There's a lot of market interest in products for glass that are almost invisible to the human eye. And that's where you get into like ultraviolet markings. I get asked about that a lot. I'd say the jury is still out on whether those are truly effective, in part because it seems like their effectiveness depends on how bright it is outside, how much sunlight is landing on the product. Some of them tend to deteriorate over a couple of months and then they have to be replaced. I think marking glass doesn't have to be dots, and I'm always excited to come across new innovations and creative ways people treat their windows that actually enhance the aesthetic. For example, just yesterday I was touring a library in Ottawa, and instead of dots, their windows are treated with letters. And on the inside of the window, there's markers, and you can actually treat it like a word search. And I saw kids having a really great time with that. There are buildings that have had their glass treated with artwork that reflect the surrounding culture of the building. There's all kinds of creative solutions that don't have to be dots. But to your point of how do you convince someone, I'm of the mind that we don't tell them, we show them. You show them products, what it looks like. You create an example of a really cool bird friendly building in their community, and you document it and you let them go see it. And people realize pretty quickly it's not that bad, that if you have even just the dots on your windows, usually after a couple days, you stop noticing them. They just blend in. And personally, for me, as somebody who cares about nature and our role within it, I would rather have the dots and feel like I'm doing my part than potentially have dead birds accumulating outside my home. So it's a matter of our values and our expectations.
So you mentioned going to see like a bird-friendly building. So in London, obviously there are now some at a lot at Western. Where else in London, and how do people just can they just call up if it's a public building and say, "Yeah, can I come and see?"
um, I would love it if people were calling buildings and saying, "Hey, is your glass bird friendly?" That would do wonders. We've produced a map of known existing bird friendly buildings. You can find it at birdfriendlylondon.ca/map. And on there, I've included photographs and locations of buildings that have been treated. We have a lot of that feather friendly dotted pattern I mentioned, but I'm starting to see more interest in custom designs. There are buildings at all of the post-secondary campuses in London that have been treated with bird safe markers. Parkwood Hospital has treated their glass barrier facing the forest behind. Westminster Ponds Centre had windows treated. So I'm seeing this really taking off in just the last few years. And something I'm really proud of and excited about is London is now building rapid transit centers, like
Yeah.
stations for people to catch transit all across town. And the city has committed to using bird safe glass for all of those. So if you ever visit, for example, the Western Fair Market and go look at the bus stop out front, it's got the dotted pattern. And that means that everybody who uses transit is exposed to what a bird safe building looks like. And it just becomes normal.
You mentioned the group Bird Friendly London, and I don't know if you founded it or not, but you're heavily involved in it. So, is that another way that a bird lover in the community who wants to do a little bit extra to help, save the bird population, can they get involved?
Yeah, thanks for returning to that. So I can tell you a little bit about Bird Friendly London. I was involved in founding it, but it was again part of a team exercise. We in London are certified as a bird friendly city in a program by Nature Canada called Bird Friendly Cities, which is supported by the federal government, Environment and Climate Change Canada, who you mentioned earlier, and that statistic about bird collisions.
Hmm.
London ranks as a high bird friendly city, meaning that we fulfill many of the program's criteria. And I don't take too much credit for that because London was already extremely bird friendly before I got here. And for us, it was a matter of taking stock of the many good initiatives underway. As part of that program, we struck a local team. We call it our London Bird Team, and it includes representatives from the university, myself, Nature London, Salthaven has been on it, the London Environmental Network, the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority, Friends of Stony Creek. There's been various groups that have been involved over the past few years. And yes, people absolutely can get involved with us. Visit our website, and we also have social media, Instagram and Facebook. I'm really hoping that now that I finished my PhD, I can return to investing time into this wonderful program. We try and do outreach initiatives in local schools and organize birdwatching outings. We've done workshops to treat many windows and putting out education into the community so that people understand the actions that they can take at home. So do visit our website and check it out. I'm hoping in the next year we're going to be actively recruiting new volunteers to undertake different projects. I want this to be a sustainable community led program where we're reflecting what the community wants. And because we're such a bird friendly city, there's a lot of goodwill towards protecting birds and their habitat.
And I know we've been talking about a lot of resources and that I'll make sure to, for our listeners, to include links and tags and everything in all of the show's notes so people can have access to follow up afterwards if they want. You were talking about that London is a ranks high as a bird friendly city. What's some of the criteria? Like what makes a city bird friendly?
Yeah, great question. So, Nature Canada has outlined these criteria that all cities are meant to fulfill as they strive towards that certification. It includes things like protecting birds and bird habitat, dealing with threats to birds like window collisions and free roaming cats, and that there's outreach and education happening in the community, that we're celebrating the important bird roles that birds play in people's lives. And as I said, London already was doing a lot of that work before I came along. We have a very progressive no roaming bylaw in London that makes it illegal for people to allow their dogs or cats to run at large unsupervised. We're working on getting bird safe design adopted into our local bylaws for planning new buildings. And there's a lot of signage, a lot of natural areas that are protected in our city. And so if you visit Nature Canada's website, naturecanada/BFC, you can check out the program criteria. And if you're listening from another jurisdiction, I would highly recommend organizing a local team and applying to the program because it gives you access to a very large network across Canada of people who care about similar things. And in your community, you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. You can learn from successes that others have found, borrow resources that have been produced and shared openly, and hit the ground running. And as a local team in London, something I'm really proud of is that a lot of the education work we've done, we've made open source. So all of our pamphlets and template letters and that sort of thing can be found on our website and adapted and shared and used all over the world. And so it's about setting an example and bringing people along.
So I was thinking as I was preparing for this episode, and that statistic that we talked about earlier from Environment Canada, that anywhere between 16 and 42 million birds are
Mhm.
dying from building strikes in Canada every year. If you are successful and all of those 16 to 42 million birds are saved, they're going back into the ecosystem. What kind of, that's got to have an impact. Can the ecosystem support having that many birds reintroduced?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think about this a lot. The statistic that you referenced, it's a range, right?
Yeah.
16 to 42 million. There's a lot of uncertainty, and that statistic actually comes from a paper that was published in 2013, and it was called "A First Estimate for Collisions Mortality in Canada." I think actually it's a conservative estimate, and there's a strong chance that more birds are being killed than we have accounted for because there's a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of things we can't track directly, and we have to kind of produce an educated best guess. For example, many of the birds that hit windows, they fly away, and that doesn't mean that they don't die from their injuries. It just might not happen instantly. If a bird is killed in the springtime and they're in the middle of feeding their offspring, and they're not able to help those offspring reach maturity, that is, extended mortality from collision. I've had many instances where birds will hit a window, they survive the impact, and they're picked up by a predator like a cat or a raccoon. And it's ultimately that predator that ends their life, but they would have never been susceptible if it weren't for that initial collision. So there's a lot of complex factors that interact. Returning to your question, though, of if all of those birds were miraculously saved and had never been killed by a collision in the first place, what would that mean? Well, the birds that are most vulnerable to collisions seem to be migratory species. There's a lot of resident species that don't migrate that are also vulnerable, but in terms of population declines, it seems like migratory birds are being lost more quickly. And when I say migratory, I mean that those birds are only in London for part of each year. They fly north in the spring to their breeding grounds, often in the boreal forest, and then they fly further south back to, the United States, Central South America, to their overwintering grounds. And wherever those birds go, they provide services that benefit the local environment and people. That's things like scattering seeds that might grow into trees, eating insects that might be pests for our agriculture, like coffee production. They pollinate flowers, And they also provide many cultural services, like bird feeding, for example, is an enormously important industry in North America. Ecotourism. Birds are precious in indigenous cultures all over the world. Here on Turtle Island, they're often considered relatives, where we call them, wildlife or biodiversity. And so birds are just valuable in so many ways. And if you restore bird populations, you're restoring all that value that we're losing at an unsustainable rate. I think preventing collisions is one of the easier ways that we can help to sustain bird populations that are declining. It's a problem with known solutions. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money. And when you get people doing the steps, like solving the easier problems and caring about it, then it helps to provide that motivation to keep going, to plant native species, to keep their cats indoors or train them to wear a leash. And it just shifts our culture. And so, yeah, I mean, I think absolutely the environment can support those birds. We should be trying to bring birds back from the brink of decline. The world used to have many more birds in it than it does today, in part because of human activity. And it's our responsibility to put that back in a good way.
Is there one species, one or two species that you are that much more susceptible to the window strikes? You mentioned it's mainly migratory birds, but are there a couple species in there that are more prone to it?
Are some species that have been characterized as what we call super colliders. Like they're especially vulnerable to crashing into buildings. And we're not exactly sure why. There's different hypotheses, but that means when we control for the amount of birds in the environment of a particular species or their relative abundance, even when you control for that, the birds are still more likely to hit than other species. There are some birds that are just way more common than others, is what I'm alluding to. Some of those birds include ovenbirds, white-throated sparrows. American robins are quite vulnerable. It seems like the rate of birds colliding also varies geographically. There are some cities that have way more of a certain species colliding than elsewhere. And so there's a lot of important research to be done to characterize which birds are the most susceptible, especially bird species at risk that we know are in trouble. How can we best protect them in their habitats? But my attitude as a scientist is we already know enough about this problem to act on mobilizing the solutions. We need to continue the research, but we should not let the absence of certainty be a barrier to solving the problem in the world.
Right. It's that paralysis. If you don't act, right, it's just paralysis and nothing happens, right? The birds are definitely lucky to have you in their corner, Brendan. Of all the birds that you have seen over the course of your work, do you have a favorite bird? Is there a favorite or a memory that sticks out with a bird interaction?
That's a tough question. I think it depends when you ask me. Um,
Okay.
I really love a bird called the chimney swift, which has cultural importance in London because we have a long-standing chimney swift monitoring program. This is a very unique bird in the sense that its body is unlike any other bird I've ever encountered. It's actually incapable of landing on the ground. Its
Oh,
legs are very specialized and it only is able to land on a vertical surface. The reason the bird is called the chimney swift is because of the bird's tendency to spend each night roosting inside of a chimney. And it is a species at risk in Canada. It's declined by over 90%, in part because we no longer build buildings with chimneys. We cap our chimneys to keep critters from getting in. And the birds are also very dependent on healthy insect populations, which are in decline. But if you ever have an opportunity at night and there's a brick chimney in your neighborhood, go outside and listen just around sunset to see if you hear chittering in the night sky. And you might look way up and see something that almost looks like a bat, if you can make it out. Those birds will dive into the chimney and land on the inside on the wall. They do like a total 180 and then they cling to the wall and they spend a lot of their lives in that chimney. They're a migratory bird that will leave London in the fall and then come back in the spring. I had the opportunity to record over 1,400 swifts entering the Labatt Brewery chimney in the span of like 15 minutes. It was
oh my
crazy. It was
gosh.
like a bird tornado. Um, yeah, and I love that bird because it shows how resilient nature can be. That when we cut down all the forests that the birds depended on, those birds used to roost inside of hollowed out dead tree trunks. They didn't have them, so they switched to using chimneys. And now the chimneys are getting wiped out, and birds are, having to figure out other ways of coexisting with people in a modified landscape. And when you think about how resilient nature is and that we ourselves are part of nature, it helps to inspire us to keep going. And even when things get really hard, knowing that we have resilience, that we can lean into our communities and our knowledge and our adaptability and make the most of things.
I loved our conversation today. Just so inspiring, but I think that we've really just kind of scratched the surface. We'll have to have you back on a later episode to chat about birds in more detail.
That sounds like a great time.
Thank you for coming in. And thank you for tuning in today. As I mentioned, I've included lots of links in the episode notes. There's so many resources. And so Flap Canada, for example, they'll have information there about how to prevent the birds from flying into the window, the best places to put your bird feeder, and get the kids involved, because there are lots of resources for them too. If you have any questions about what you've heard today, make sure you reach out. You can email me at wildaboutwildlife@salthaven.org, and I will follow up with Brendon and make sure to get back to you. Thanks so much for making time for Wild About Wildlife. Till next time, take care.